Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave this video a like, and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I am bringing you another episode of Quick Movie Reviews. And yeah, I have 7 movies on the docket today. I am going to be talking about movies from all sorts of different levels of recency, so some will be as early as August, whereas some will be much more recent in October to late September. But yeah, let's not waste any more time, and let's get started with the first movie I will be discussing on my list. So just as a little bit of a preview, there will be more horror movies on this review list than there are of any other genre, and I think that's just because of the season. But we are going to start off with a definitively horror movie, which is Speak No Evil. Now, I'll admit that I went into this movie a little bit apprehensive because this was a remake of a foreign language film by the same name. And I am always a little bit hesitant about when foreign language movies get Americanized. A lot of times they have the problem of being much milder than the original movie, or sort of taking what the original movie did and sort of ruining it in a lot of ways. I will say that this movie was a pleasant surprise, and I was always going to check it out because I am a huge fan of James McAvoy. He is one of the best actors working today, just very talented, so I was going to see it regardless of if it was good or bad, and the trailers did leave me intrigued, even if this movie was very overexposed in terms of trailers. You couldn't escape it. For at least the first part of the movie, I will say that it does follow pretty closely in line with what the original does, in terms of it being about the idea of how far will you go in terms of being respectful to people that you don't know? How far will you let them push you in terms of making you do stuff that you're uncomfortable with? Will you do it just to look better or just to seem more respectable? I do appreciate that this movie takes that a little bit of a different route in some ways. It doesn't necessarily emphasize on the horror of manners as much as the original did. Instead, this one is more focusing on the respective marriages of the two central couples and how complex they are. We've got the main characters, Ben and Louise, who seem to have everything together on the surface, but as we discover more throughout the movie, they were originally planning to get divorced, and there's all sorts of issues going on with them that they just don't want to show to their daughter, versus seemingly the very, very happy relationship between Patty and Kira. But there is something even darker going on beneath the surface with them and the son that they have, Ant. And the movie explores that in ways that get increasingly more horrific as the movie goes on. And yeah, there's a lot to like about this movie, I think. The most primary I am going to have to say is James McAvoy as Patty. I think if anybody else had played this character, it wouldn't have functioned as well, because James McAvoy just absolutely knocks it out of the park here. His physicality in this performance is horrific. You can feel that at any point he's going to snap. Aisling Franciosi is great as his wife, Kira. I actually really liked her here, and she turned in a bit more of a subtle performance here that I really appreciated. She provides a very interesting counterpart to Patty, and she has more complicated stuff going on here than the Kira did in the original Speak No Evil, which I do appreciate. I do appreciate that they gave her a little bit more complexity. It makes her more interesting. And that goes for the central couple here, too. I will say one of the problems I had with the original Speak No Evil was that the central couple is just not very interesting at all, and you don't really find much reason to care for them. In this one, I did find more reason to care for them, as it did focus on their relationship problems a little more. I think Scoot McNairy was great as Ben Dalton. I really did like his performance and found him to work in the main character role, and Mackenzie Davis was quite good as Louise Dalton as well. The kids were also really good in this too. I really liked both kid performances. Alex Leffler is great as Agnes, and I think she does a good job at embodying the character arc that her character goes on. And Dan Howe is really good as Ant. His performance is silent throughout the movie. He doesn't talk once, but you can tell his feelings just through his facial expressions. Scare-wise, this movie is maybe in some ways not as tense as the original was, but there are still some really good balls to the wall crazy moments, especially in the end of the movie where the film takes a surprising turn that makes it different from the original. And this is where I appreciate that this movie actually did try something different. It doesn't try to just be a mediocre replication of the original. Instead, it becomes its own thing. And for the context of this movie, the ending makes sense. Now, I will acknowledge that the ending of this movie and the climax of this movie very much so does feel like it is intended for an American audience and what an American audience would like. So maybe that is why I do enjoy it a bit more than the foreign language film end. But at the same time, this ending of the foreign language one, while it is considerably darker and more foreboding, it does feel like it comes a bit out of nowhere in terms of what the rest of the film was doing, but there are still some issues I do have with this remake. For an example, I do think, especially in the first half, like I said, it does stay a little bit too closely to what the original was doing, and it can become a little bit repetitive. And also, I do think the movie takes a little bit too long to pick up to what it's doing, but it is not like a boring watch or anything. Not by any means. I did really enjoy this and found it to be a solidly done film. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is a film that I have been highly anticipating ever since I saw the trailer that just sort of blew my mind and made me so intrigued, and that is The Substance. Now, this is directed by some Caroline Fauger, who made the movie Revenge a couple years back, and I'll admit I was not the biggest fan of Revenge. I found it to be, well, a very typical revenge horror movie. Still, I was curious with this movie, especially with the very interesting trailer that came out. And thankfully, my expectations were met and perhaps even surpassed. This movie, man, it is an absolutely wild journey. I mean, I don't want to spoil too much about what it does, and there's one thing I'm going to say. I am not the biggest fan of body horror, never have been, and this one does it very well. And this one is not for the faint of heart, I will say. There were many times when I wanted to look away from the screen just because of how far it was going, and every time you think it can't go any more extreme, it does. This movie might put some of the modern-day Evil Dead movies to shame, which is really saying something. And I like that the movie shows right from the start, in terms of its theme, that it is not going for subtlety at all. This movie is showing the depravity of Hollywood, especially in how it treats women and their bodies as they get older. And the fact that it disposes them once they get too old or aren't deemed viably beautiful enough in terms of the standard that Hollywood sets for them. It embodies this very well through the absolutely slimy, despicable character of Harvey, played very well by Dennis Quaid. He plays this character eerily well, and you just feel sick to your stomach anytime he comes on the screen. Beauty is, of course, originally shown in this movie at the beginning as very alluring and very sexy, played through Margaret Qualley's character Sue, who is just really good in this movie. Her and Demi Moore are both great, and it's interesting to see Margaret Qualley playing sort of like the evil version of her, the version of her that desires to be beautiful above all else and will do anything to push forward that beauty. And then we have Demi Moore as the main character, Elizabeth Sparkle, who is struggling with her body image and the fact that she used to be such a popular Hollywood star, but Hollywood has disposed of her. And you can feel for her more than any other character in this. You understand the decisions that she makes and how she pushes forward her desire for having the perfect body, but it becomes increasingly tragic as the movie goes on, but also increasingly more delirious and desperate. I also have to give huge props to the soundtrack of this movie. It is very 80s, and feels like something Nine Inch Nails would make if they were a part of a horror movie, and I absolutely love it for that reason. Just so many fun moments in terms of what the music is doing, and it fits perfectly for the satirical tone that this film has throughout. I was left speechless when this movie ended, I'll admit. There were many moments in here that left my jaw hanging open in terms of what they were doing. There aren't many flaws with it at all in terms of what it was doing. I guess there are some points where it can get maybe a little bit too silly for its own good, but at the same time, subtlety is not this movie's MO, and not by any means. I would recommend this if you like body horror, but if you don't, if you're not someone who can stomach this stuff, then all I can say is go in with caution, but it is a really good movie. 4.5 out of 5 stars, and one of my favorites of the year. You know, when I was creating my list of movies to review for this section of short movie reviews, I was not intentional at all in putting Uglies right next to The Substance, two movies about body image and about what constitutes beauty, but that happened, so I'm going to move forward like it was an intentional choice. So yeah, let's talk about another movie with beauty standard commentary in it, and that is Uglies here. And it is a Netflix-only released movie. And yeah, that seems fitting for this movie because, man, this is awful. And it's not surprising to me that it's bad because this movie feels like 10 years too late in many ways. I remember I read Uglies when it originally came out back when I was in either elementary or middle school. I can't remember which year I was in, but it was Uglies, the novel series was actually before the Hunger Games. It was before the dystopian genre really exploded and took off for the time that it did in the 2010s. So, yeah, this movie does feel too late in more ways than one. And that's not to say the original Uglies novel is bad. I wouldn't say it is at all. But I would say that it was not nearly as impactful of a dystopian novel as ones like The Hunger Games were. Honestly, it's been shown that a lot of older dystopian novels have not been successful as adaptations. You can look to the modern adaptation of Fahrenheit 451 as another example of this, or the newer Divergent movies that were absolute disasters. I think a lot of the problems come down to the fact that the world does not look that bad in terms of it supposedly being dystopian. And the main crux of the movie is that the reason the world is dystopian is because they're divided into people who are ugly and people who are pretty, and I think there can be something to be said, especially for a younger audience, and talking about beauty standards. I feel like attaining beauty has become a new popular thing to do now with the Gen Z audience and with the rise of TikTok. I don't think it pursues a message in a particularly well done way. It feels very cliched, and I know a lot of people critique the movie for having actors and actresses that were too beautiful to play the ugly characters, but I actually think that was an okay choice because the idea is that these characters are not supposed to be bad looking. They're just ugly, quote unquote, in comparison to the people who go through this process of becoming pretty. And yeah, the bigger problem is that the people who look pretty in this movie, it just feels like an Instagram filter more than anything else. There's a lot of other problems with this movie as well. I feel like the acting is just mediocre all around. Joey King, I know she has it in her to give a good performance, but I feel like she has the bad luck of being put into some of the worst movies ever. She just seems to be placed into bad movie after bad movie, and a lot of them tend to be Netflix originals. And she's really just not great here either. And her character is portrayed as a very one-note slate here, which was not an issue in the book at all, so I don't know why that happened in this movie. I also found Chase Stokes to be surprisingly boring as Paris. For as much as I like him in Outer Banks, he does nothing for me here. I think maybe the only person in here who I really enjoyed was Brienne Zhu as Shay. She did a pretty good job in her character, especially in her transformation that happens near the end of the movie. Laverne Cox probably gave the best performance here as Dr. Cable. She played this character fittingly intimidating, and I found her to actually be pretty menacing. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of her in the movie. But, I mean, none of the acting is particularly remarkable here, and there's nothing that really made me go wow or anything, and in fact I was left bored for most of the movie. Visually, the movie just looks unremarkable, lots of obvious green screen effects. I just didn't really like anything this movie did in terms of how it was adapting the book, which has a far more vibrant world and has a far more interesting world building as well. Just a really not well done adaptation that left me just wondering what the point was. 1 out of 5 stars. Next up is another horror movie, Strange Darling, and if you like a movie that's a little bit twisty and plays with your mind in terms of your expectations, then this is the movie for you, because you're going to go in expecting one thing to happen, but you're going to get a total other thing, and I like that the movie establishes that pretty early on. We've got two characters who seem pretty stock characters and seem like you know what role they're going to play in, with Willa Fitzgerald playing the lady and Kyle Gallner playing the demon. But as the movie goes on, you'll see it playing around with your expectations as to the roles that men and women can play in the world of horror. And I think it's very interesting in doing that, and it did leave me with a smile on my face in terms of how it does those twists and turns. I thought it was pretty clever. There were a couple places near the end where it started getting a little bit repetitive, I thought, and there was a little bit of a message near the end of the movie that I thought was a little bit questionable in terms of how a woman character reacts to another woman character that felt maybe a little bit politically motivated. I had such a fun time with it. The main two actors are a great reason for this. Willa Fitzgerald is excellent as the lady. I loved her performance in this movie. She was easily the highlight, and it was very interesting to see her character develop, as well as Kyle Gallner as the demon. He was very physically imposing, and you could feel the menace coming from him, but also very interesting to see how he developed in the movie. The scares in this movie were well done, and while I wouldn't call this the scariest movie I've seen by any means, it was definitely a very good thriller and really developed its thrills well. And I think a good reason for that was that the movie was telling its story out of order and building up your expectations in different ways. Really strongly done. I don't want to say much about it because I think it's a movie best experienced as blind as possible. 4 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about the movie Blink Twice. And I'm going to be honest, I don't have much to say about this one because this movie I sort of forgot about as soon as I left the theater. There's some things it does that are fine. It sort of reminds me, unfortunately, of just sort of a cheap version of Get Out. It is the same idea of people who are supposedly acting like they're good people and care, in this case, about women, and care about women and their rights and their independence. But as the movie goes on, you can see that they are in it for something decidedly darker and much more twisted. It's fine in terms of how it presents itself, but I'm not going to call any of it particularly remarkable, and it's also not particularly subtle either. I think it sort of hits you over the head with its theme in a way that makes you say, okay, we get it, you don't need to keep saying it over and over. And I think a lot of that does come down to Zoe Kravitz being a first-time director here. And the movie makes itself even more perplexing by having an ending that just really makes no sense, and it makes the main character decidedly more unlikable than she should be because of the choices that she makes. Performance-wise, people are generally doing okay here. I will say, unfortunately, I didn't find Naomi Ackie to be that remarkable as Frida. I found her to be pretty mediocre in the main character role. I think this movie severely underutilized Christian Slater as Vic. I really would have liked to have seen more in him in this movie, and I feel like they just reduced him to a boring comedic relief. Simon Rex was actually pretty good as Cody. I did like what they did with him, and Adria Arjona was probably the best element in here as Sarah. She definitely felt like she should have been the main character here, but otherwise this movie was pretty mediocre. I guess cinematography-wise, there were some interesting shots going on. I did like how they dropped the title. It was pretty cool. But otherwise, this movie just left me with not much to say and just shrugging my shoulders. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me. Next up is a movie where I have so many thoughts going in my head, but I just don't know how to organize them, and that is Francis Ford Coppola's movie Megalopolis. No one can deny that this movie is a fully realized vision. Like, it is Francis Ford Coppola's vision to the biggest extent that it possibly can be. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing in this movie. The Roman Empire they're talking about here is decidedly unsubtle because the place where this movie is taking place, New Rome, is obviously meant to be a representation of New York in an alternate reality, and it seems to be Francis's own commentary on the fact that if we aren't careful, then much like Rome, America will fall and collapse into disrepair if we can't unite and come together and start having a healthy dialogue with one another. I just wish that the movie had done a little bit better in commenting on it, because all the other side stuff that they were trying to do in this movie leaves it a very jumbled mess, but admittedly an intriguing jumbled mess. I can't say that I hated this movie because there were some cool things in it that I enjoyed. Now, visually, I was worried about the movie because the trailers made it look sort of ugly, but when I went into the movie, it actually looked quite beautiful, and there were many striking moments that I enjoyed. I also found performances to be ranging from interesting and actually masterful to downright just embarrassingly awful. Adam Driver is great as Caesar Catalina. He makes some very intriguing acting choices in here, including one about going to the club that I'm sure you've seen in social media because it has been memed to death at this point. But I like that he dedicates to his acting choices and makes them as silly as he can, so it works for his very egomaniac character, Caesar. I also think Giancarlo Esposito was good as the mayor. He was playing his role a little bit more subtle, which I appreciated. It provided a nice counterpart to a lot of the over-the-top performances in this movie. But I almost wish they would have given him a little bit more to do, even though, interestingly, he was the second main character in the movie. The same goes for Nathalie Emanuel as Julia, the mayor's daughter, who is sort of serving as the person through which we are seeing this movie. She is, in effect, sort of the main character of the movie, but because she is serving as a vessel for the audience, we don't really get to know her that well, beyond her just being interested in Caesar for reasons that the audience would be interested in Caesar. I thought that Jason Schwartzman was pretty good as Jason. I liked what he brought to the movie. And yeah, the Dustin Hoffman was pretty fun for the small moments that he was in the movie too, even if his performance was once again pretty silly. And that's a big theme that goes throughout this movie, is that some of it feels a little bit silly, and I think intentionally so in some places, but then there are places where you're supposed to take it deeply seriously, to the point where it becomes, yeah, something of a mind bend in your head, because you don't know what you're supposed to think about particular scenes. But I like that it does get you thinking. It's a movie full of just such interesting contradictions that are very hard to parse through. And yeah, that's where we lead into some negatives of this movie as well. Jon Voight was not good as Hamilton Crassus III. I found his performance to be very weak, and there was a moment near the end of the movie with him that made me laugh out loud, or rather want to laugh out loud, just because of how awfully executed it was. And then we have Shia LaBeouf's character. Oh man, he does awful here. He plays his character so over the top that it is laughably bad, and anytime he was on screen, I was cringing. I just didn't care at all for what he brought to the table. Whereas on the other hand, we have another super campy performance from, surprisingly, Aubrey Plaza, out of all people, as WoW Platinum. I actually really enjoyed it. It was not something I would have expected coming from her, but it worked. But yeah, this movie is a mess. There's no denying that. There's a lot going on in this movie. I think it might be too big for its own good, but I'm not going to say I wasn't ever bored, and I was ever bored in it. I found it to be interesting, at the very least. And I can't say that I hated it, either, but I can't say that I loved it. So, just an interesting one that I think will be reflected on for many years to come, I'm going to be honest. Even though this movie was a bomb, I think the people who saw it, there will be a dialogue there, which maybe was the intent that Francis Ford Coppola had all along. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, let's end off with the movie Rebel Ridge, which was another Netflix original and a decidedly better one. I had a great time with this movie, and a lot of that had to do with its very airtight plot about police corruption in a small town and the one man who exposed it and took it down just through a simple act of trying to free his cousin from jail, or bail his cousin out, but the cops refusing to do so. This movie is really well done in terms of its structure. It reminds me of sort of a more toned down and more realistic John Wick. And I think it works in terms of delivering that premise. I don't think it ever feels like a direct ripoff of that movie, unlike some other John Wick quote-unquote ripoffs out there. This one feels like its distinctly own thing, while still having thrilling action elements in it. One thing that I really liked about this movie that I found unique is that our main character, Terry Richmond, played excellently by Aaron Pierre, doesn't actually kill anyone in this movie. Plus, the fact that he had honorably served in the military makes him all the more sympathetic, and I just really liked following him in the movie and found him to be a great character. I like that they originally show him as stoic, but start showing more and more vulnerabilities to him as the movie goes on. Anna Sophia Robb brings a really just excellent performance in here as Summer McBride. I found her to be just excellent in this movie and a great counterpart to Terry. And then we have a very intimidating villain in Don Johnson as a police chief. He is terrifying here, and even though he isn't in the movie much, you can still feel his presence over the whole film. He really brings something special to this movie. But yeah, action-wise, this movie is great. It's well choreographed. I love the small town setting this movie has. It brings the plot home effectively, and the commentary that the movie has is well done. It doesn't bang you over the head with it, but still makes you feel sure to know what is going on. If anything, I wish the movie would have picked up a little sooner, but I did like overall how it was paced, and I did find it to be a really fun watch. Very strong 4 out of 5 stars, one of the better action movies of this year. So yeah, that ends this episode of Quick Movie Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the movies I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.